What's going on, Catella geographers? This is Mr. Majewski. You know, I'm sitting here and I'm going over the spring break assignment, and I look at my geography stuff, and I'm like, well, they have the video to watch, and then I look, and there's no video there. Dawns on Mr. Majewski, I never did nor posted your video for agriculture, so here it is. Anyways, we're on to the geography of agriculture. This is a topic that our students do not have a lot of knowledge about, and so therefore, we start out with an introduction to the geography of agriculture. We take it kind of slow here. Hopefully, I won't go too fast for you. The beauty of this is you can always pause it, right? Go back, hear it again if you need to hear any particular part a second time. Please remember there will be a rather large quiz on these particular slides. So gosh, I hope you watch the video. I hope you are taking extra notes and highlighting and or annotating your notes as you go. Your slides, I should say. And I hope you review those, right? Because obviously you're not going to have access to them and there will be a large quiz. So anyways, let's get to the introduction of geography of agriculture. Let's get started on this. All right. Good Lord, there we go. All right, so what is agriculture? Well, we start with a real simple definition. It's modifying Earth's surface through the cultivation, which means the raising or growing of plants, and or the rearing of animals, which means the handling of animals, right? So modifying Earth's surface by growing plants or cultivating plants and rearing animals or raising animals. Now, prior to agriculture developing, and by the way, we think it originally probably developed kind of almost accidentally, before the development of agriculture, we experienced what was called pre-agriculture. You probably know it more familiarly as hunting and gathering. I believe we've talked about this earlier in the semester or in the school year. Hunting and gathering is pretty self-explanatory. It's when you hunt a game in order to have meat provided to you. And then at the same time, when, for instance, game is scarce, for instance, during the winter months when game isn't available, then you gather nuts and berries and other substances that you can survive on. So hunting and gathering was generally, humans who conducted it, and this was all humans before the development of agriculture. They existed in small groups because hunting and gathering really only supports small populations because you never have any sort of excess, you never have any extra, you can only really keep what you can carry. Hunters and gatherers are generally migratory, which means they move around from place to place throughout the year. Now, usually this was following games of herds for game, for animals, for food, I should say, goodness. Now, normally this was done in order to follow game around throughout the year so that could be hunted and then consumed. So you kind of followed the game. Think about like Native Americans who used to follow the buffalo, the bison all around. And so they lived kind of a nomadic lifestyle. Well, that's how all hunters and gatherers were before the development of agriculture. So they're migratory. They're dispersed. What that means is you had small groups that were fairly spread out from one another. The reason for that, of course, is if you're a migratory group, then you're going to come into a lot of other contact with migratory groups that are around you unless you have large distances between you and them to avoid conflict, to avoid competition over resources. And so generally you had small groups of humans that were very spread out and dispersed. You didn't have any cities or towns or anything like that. You had small groups living together. Again, they hunted throughout much of the year, and then they would gather berries and nuts to supplement the meat that they were able to hunt for. Anybody who's done fishing or hunting before knows it's not consistent. Sometimes you can get a lot, sometimes you catch nothing. And so therefore, it's good to have berries and nuts to supplement your food. Anyways, the problem with hunting and gathering, one, it's a perfectly fine way to survive, right? You can clearly usually hunt and gather enough in order to support yourself, your family, maybe a small group beyond that. But it does not allow you to build up any excesses. So there's never a surplus. So you're always very much dependent on what you find at that exact moment. And so populations never really grow very much with hunting and gathering societies. Today, there's only about 250,000 people that are hunters-gatherers out of a total 7 billion on the planet. So obviously hunting and gathering has really almost been wiped out, and it's practiced by people where it does exist who live in really incredibly remote places, incredibly isolated physically and culturally from the rest of society. All of them are located in peripheral regions of the world. And we're talking like authentic hunters and gatherers. So don't want you to think, oh, Native Americans living on a reservation. Well, they still do a little hunting and gathering, maybe for cultural purposes or ceremonial purposes. We don't count them. We're talking about folks who survive and depend on hunting and gathering to this day. So these are usually indigenous people, natives, in tropical locations, Africa, Southeast Asia, even in the Amazon rainforest in South America. Now, so the big question is, when do we switch over to agriculture? And the answer is, well, different times and different places. Agriculture is a unique thing because we have multiple hearth areas, which of course, remember, means source area. So we know that agriculture starts in certain places, or at least certain crops and animals started in certain places, and then they spread outward from there. So what we do is we go through the hearth areas, and there's going to be 4 major hearth areas for agricultural crops. You'll notice they do not all pop up at the same time, and they are not influenced by one another, we believe. These are all independent sources of innovation. So it's a good example of independent innovation here, where things spontaneously originated without having any influence on each other. Anyways, hearth number 1 is the most important. It is the most famous. It is responsible for the most crops. It's the oldest or one of the oldest, and it's really significant. Southwest Asia, all right? So you normally think of Southwest Asia, you think of the Middle East. You might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, the desert? Well, hey, Southwest Asia has tons of incredibly fertile territory. Some of the most lush, fertile territory in the world is located in an area of Iraq, Iran, and it's known as the Fertile Crescent. And it's named for the intersection of a bunch of rivers in that area, 2 major ones, the Tigris and Euphrates, and they form kind of a crescent-like shape of land in between them. This is the area where the first crops, the first agriculture, was domesticated for the first time. So our first hearth is Southwest Asia, specifically the Fertile Crescent. And the original crops there were domesticated 8,000 BC. So we're talking 10,000 years ago, folks. So they are one of our original hearths and maybe the most important for a number of reasons. We know that wheat and barley were both domesticated there. Wheat and barley are both grains, and wheat obviously is used for products, mostly bread. Barley, of course, can be used for bread or rolls, but it can also be used, for instance, to ferment beer as well. So anyways, wheat and barley, by the way, those could also both be used to feed animals as well. At the same time, at the same place, we also see the development or the domestication of olives and lentil beans as well. This makes sense to us because the Southwest Asia, technically the extreme Southwest Asia, butts up against the Mediterranean. And olive and lentil bean are Mediterranean foods that we associate, with Greeks and Italians and some of these others. And so it does make sense that they would have originated in a place that borders the Mediterranean. Olive and lentil beans also originated there. So wheat is the big one, barley and wheat especially, but also olives and lentils all developed there. And then from there it diffused not only east towards Central Asia, but it also spread west into Europe, which really gives us a lot of explanation as to why wheat becomes so popular in Europe. Anyways, we're talking about this hearth right here, this shaded area. And again, barley, 2 types of wheat, lentil beans, oats, rye, all of those are types of wheat, essentially. Of course, you're going to get the olive as well there. Anyways, 8,000 BC, we start to see domesticated for the first time. Your second major hearth, around the same exact time, actually, but separate and independent from Southwest Asia, rice was domesticated in East Asia. Makes sense. Rice is such a staple of Asian cultures, and that's because it's been the staple of the diet for over 10,000 years. Again, rice, also millet. Millet is another grain. It's very similar to wheat, and that was actually domesticated in East Asia as well. And from there, the food items moved west in the direction of South Asia, and then they also moved towards Southeast Asia as well. So again, when we're talking about our second hearth area, we're talking about East Asia, and specifically China. And as you can see, we get rice, we get soybean, we get Chinese, chestnut, walnuts as well. All of them originate there. We tend to focus on rice and soybean since those are considered to be the two most significant. So again, as you're seeing here, in both of these hearths, these different crops originated. They did do it about the same time. But so one did not clearly influence the other, we believe. Let's go to our third hearth area. And our third hearth area is in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we see new crops that are domesticated in a completely separate hearth that we believe was not tied to or connected in any way to the other two that already existed. In Central and Sub-Saharan Africa, we see the development of sorghum, we see the development of yams, which are sweet potatoes, and then also unique types of millet and rice that did not exist elsewhere. Sorghum, by the way, is kind of like a nutrient-rich, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call it like a root, that can be mashed into almost like a porridge or an oatmeal-like thing and consumed. Anyways, these are all products that had not already been invented, and all seem to have originated in the Central and Sub-Saharan hearth, and they moved throughout Asia, specifically towards Southern Asia, from that area. So now we have these three dark areas that are the hearths for almost all of the agricultural products we've talked about so far. All right. Then, about 2000 BC, so about 4,000 years ago, Latin America developed its own independent hearth. Now, Latin America, there was nothing diffusing. No, Europe and Africa didn't even know about Latin America at this time. They didn't know this continent existed. So these products originated independently, probably by the natives there. Well, by the natives, by Mayans and by Aztecs and other native populations as well. In the Mexico area, corn was domesticated for the first time by, we believe, the Mayan Empire and Aztecs. Beans, cotton, squash, all of those are originated by Mexicans, or in the Mexico area, by natives in those regions. And then in Peru, potato and corn both diffused, I should say both originated separately from what was happening in Mexico around the same time. So again, a lot of products were technically originated in the Western Hemisphere. And then eventually later on, when the two societies are going to meet, products are going to be shared back and forth between the two. Anyways, please note a lot of these hearth areas had tended to be along tropical locations, right? Do you notice that? Tropical locations oftentimes had a lot of hearth, were the source of a lot of hearth areas, all right? By the way, down in Southeast Asia, there's a lesser hearth that you should be familiar with, mango, taro, coconut. So things we would probably associate with tropical locations. We believe those were first probably domesticated somewhere in Southeast Asia about, 2,000-3,000 years ago. All right, so again, know those four major hearths. You might want to remember Southeast Asia is also a smaller one. You know, how did our original crops get domesticated? Well, the answer is a lot of these were probably wild plants. They were like weeds. And over time, hunters and gatherers experimented with these. They would eat plants, you know. They would eat them and see, you know, is this healthy? Is this tasty? Does this kill me? And over time, they probably developed preferences. And then what they would do with their preference plants, and they're still in weed form at this time, is they would, just by watching, they would probably take the really most plentiful ones, or the ones that produce the biggest product. And then they would make sure to plant either a piece of the plant itself, the fruit that the plant created, or a seed, if they were able to find the seeds, and then they would grow generation after generation The idea was to grow the biggest and the best plants and to slowly domesticate them, to slowly turn them over from wild to domestic plants. Now, here's what's really interesting. The original wild plants, we believe, probably tasted pretty poor. They were not very healthy. They were very small. The original corn, when you think of like corn, you think of big corns on the cob. No, we believe the original corn on the cobs were probably like mini corn in size, and there might have only been like 2 or 3 kernels on them. So what these folks did without realizing it is they were experimenting with genetics. They were taking the best or the biggest plant, and they were planting that again, or the fruit from that again. And then the next generation would, in theory, be bigger and bigger and bigger and healthier, until eventually they took wild plants and through the generations, by continually growing and growing and killing off the ones that were, or destroying the ones that were weak and small, they were able to domesticate these plants and turn them into actually cultivated crops. Just like you would with a wild animal, where you start with a wild animal and then over time, over generations, you slowly try to domesticate it and make it obey. That's kind of what they did with plants as well. They experimented with the plants, and then through generations, they were able to domesticate them, make them bigger, better, more plentiful, healthier. We also have animal hearths, all right? So separate from where plants developed. And again, some plants developed as seed plants, which means people planted seeds. Others were called just crop plants. That meant that you actually took a piece of the old plant, and that might just be the fruit that fell off of it, and you planted that instead of planting a seed. So, for instance, like pineapple is planted where you take a piece of the plant and you put it into the ground, and then a new pineapple grows out of that. So, that would be a good example of a crop plant. All right? Animal hearths. The original animal to be domesticated was the dog. That happened in 10,000 BC, 12,000 years ago. So, before even the first plants were domesticated, dogs were. And of course, it was Southwest Asia. They were the first place to domesticate animals. And they're also the first place that integrated both, that raised animals alongside growing crops. So they were way ahead of the rest of the world. That's why some of our earliest major civilizations, the Assyrians, the Persians, right, the Babylonians, all of these were located in the Fertile Crescent, and they were able to grow and become powerful by taking advantage of this agriculture before anybody else was able to. Anyways, Southwest Asia was also the site that cattle were domesticated, goats were domesticated, pigs, and sheep. Probably 4 of the 5 most important farm animals that we have. Cattle, goats, pigs, and sheep. Well, definitely 4 of the top 6. All domesticated in the same place. Again, individuals dealing with wild animals over time, kind of domesticating them and turning them into plants that could be used for animals that could be raised and used for our advantage. Animals would be used by these folks in this area to clear the land. They graze the land and they clear it. That means they get rid of the grass and other roots, which makes it easier to plant new crops. Then they would prepare the land, which meant oftentimes you might let some animals in to fertilize the land, right? Or to maybe graze on certain products like the weeds in the area. So you would use them not only to clear, but also to prepare the land with their fertilizer. And then you could also obviously use animals for milk. You could use them for meat as well, depending on your circumstance. The second major hearth area is Central Asia. Now, this is easy for us to remember. One, it's about 4,000 years after Southwest Asia, so they're way behind in terms of time frame. And they only are responsible for the domestication of one product, and that's the horse. So Central Asia is where they domesticate the horse. And that makes sense. Think of all the horsemen and the barbarian hordes of Genghis Khan, right? He was located in Central Asia. His horsemen were master soldiers and master riders on horseback, and they were able to dominate much of Asia and Europe. And so not a surprise, Central Asia is where our horses are domesticated. It also makes sense because there's massive wild horse herds that were in that area. Around the same time that horses were being domesticated in Central Asia, chickens were being domesticated in South Asia, particularly in India. That probably has something to do with the fact, remember, that beef is taboo in Hindu society, and so they were looking for other sources of protein very early on. Remember, Hinduism is the oldest religion, and so it was around way before many of the others, and it would make sense, therefore, that Indians, South Asians would particularly want to domesticate the chicken and other products for meat purposes. Why did agriculture develop? Two reasons. One, around 10,000 BC, we were just coming out of our last ice age. I don't know if a lot of folks realize this, but we had something called the Little Ice Age, and that was only about 12,000 years ago, or at least it ended then. So the last ice age happened fairly recently, and humans developed, technically, if everything's to be believed, well before that. Alrighty, so, areas were melting. That opened up a ton of land, particularly fresh, fertile land that had previously been consumed by the ice, a lot of green area, and of course that makes it much more land available for agriculture to develop. The other major reason is cultural. People develop preferences for wanting to stay on the same area, to stay in the same place. Some of that might be religious, right? As religion develops, people might want to stay closer to a house of worship. And people didn't really want to move around as much. They wanted to stay local. And so that is another factor why agriculture emerges. So again, I've already kind of talked about this. How did it evolve? Well, wild plants were gathered and cut. Some of those parts would oftentimes fall to the ground. They might grow into new plants over thousands of years. Humans, right, chose the very best plants that evolved, and they experimented with the new ones too. So again, here's our animal hearth map, right? And this is Southwest Asia. I told you, not only the dog, which was first, but then cattle, pig, sheep, goat, all domesticated there. In the same place that grain is being domesticated. I should say wheat is being domesticated. So this is like that ground zero. This is the heart of geography of agriculture. Chickens in India, horses in Central Asia. The turkey was the only major animal that was located in the New World in the Western Hemisphere. So the turkey, the llama, the alpaca down in South America, those are the major animals that are domesticated there. So anyways, you need to know these hearth areas. You need to know in a general area, you need to know where they are. You need to know like a couple of the main crops that are located there. And you would need to be able to explain, the difference between seed and crop agriculture or growing. Really that's what I would say about that. Let's move on. All right, let's go to the agricultural revolution. So we believe since the beginning of humanity, there have been three major agricultural revolutions. These are where major changes happened that allowed agriculture to take place or changed it radically, transformed it. And you need to know each of these. You need to know roughly when they occurred, and you need to know why they were so significant to the development of humanity. All right, so our first agricultural revolution. This is the original agricultural revolution, obviously, and it happened about 10,000 BC, so it happened about 12,000 years ago. This is when farming developed for the first time. So this is a revolution because for the first time, people are going to stop hunting and gathering, or maybe only hunt and gather certain parts of the year, and then the rest of the year, or maybe all of the year, now they're going to stay put, and they're going to stay in one location, and they're going to grow crops instead of going out and looking for them. Now, this is simple farming. It's farming for subsistence reasons. You need to know that word. Make sure you do. Subsistence is very simple. All it means is growing food for yourself and your own needs and for the needs of your family. All right? So all farming was done primarily for your family's needs or your immediate needs. If you had extra, you could sell it, but the goal was to just produce enough to meet your own needs. And farming was sustainable. What we mean by that is people did something called shifting cultivation, which is a style of farming. And it's not really harsh on the environment. because of how it is conducted. As long as very few people are doing it, which was the case back then because the population wasn't huge, it's not too terribly harmful to the environment. Anyways, it's not surprisingly, when we switch over to agriculture for the first time, you start to see your first towns and cities pop up. Up to that, they didn't really exist. Society was spread out, they were dispersed, they were relatively lowly populated. Now we're going to have our first towns and eventually our first cities pop up. So urbanization, our first urban revolution, the development of cities, is a direct effect of our first agricultural revolution. So now we're growing crops for the first time. It's going to start slowly. It's going to only start in a few places, but over time it's going to spread in terms of the number of crops, in terms of the number of food sources, and in terms of where it is practiced. So that went on for thousands and thousands of years, and to be honest with you, there were not many major changes to those systems. Up until a few hundred years ago, most everybody still was a farmer, and most everybody farmed for their own needs for subsistence purposes. But the second major shift, the second major transformation, the second major agricultural revolution occurred about 300 to 400 years ago, depends on where you were. It started in about the 1600s. In other places, maybe it began in the 1700s, so right around that time period. And we call it the second agricultural revolution. Now, it occurs as an effect of the Industrial Revolution. So right as the Industrial Revolution takes place, so does this. They go hand in hand. This is when farming now is transformed because it becomes mechanized. Mechanized is a fancy word that means you produce things using machines. So machines are introduced into farming for the first time. Things like plows, things like eventually tractors, things like combines, or separators or sifters, all are developed. Spinning machines that can then take farm products like wool and spin them faster. All of these are products that are developed through mechanization, through the use of machines. And the other major change is that farming for the first time becomes commercial, which means for the first time, farmers begin to produce products not just to feed themselves, but instead, in some instances, specifically to sell their product in markets to make the highest amount of profit. They can then take that profit and they can purchase the food they need and, in theory, over time, produce buy more agricultural products and machinery to speed their process up even further. Some of the earliest, and by the way, you achieve this through massive new developments with inventions and new technology. And that's exactly what occurred as a result of the Industrial Revolution, where we switch over to machine production for the first time in some industries. Farming and agriculture also benefited because new inventors came up with ways to produce crops much more efficiently, much faster than we could by human or animal power. Tractors and seed drills, again, are both excellent examples. A tractor is pretty self-explanatory. A seed drill was something almost like an air gun that allowed you to shoot your seeds into the ground as you walked along to allow you to plant your crops much faster than ever before. Again, when countries switch into this second agricultural revolution, this is also tying it together with other units about the same time that they switch over into the second stage of the demographic transition. This is when you start to see them industrialize. This is when they mass produce food. They have excess supplies of food. So things like famine, hunger don't hurt them as much because they build up these excess supplies to sustain themselves. There's also, this period is known as the Second Urban Revolution. This is when now we start to see cities begin to massively expand. So, hey, in the first agricultural revolution, we saw the first towns and cities pop up. But a big city was maybe 30 or 40,000 people. That was huge. That was massive. After the second agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, cities start to become huge. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people soon. So not only does the second agricultural revolution coincide with the industrial revolution, go together, it also ushers in stage 2 of the demographic transition for countries, and it also leads to a new, much more massive urban revolution as we move to cities. If you remember, in England, a lot of farmers lost their farms. The farmers that remained developed much larger farms. They took over that land. So we had far fewer farmers producing way more than ever before with mechanization. And a lot of the farmers that lost their land moved to cities and took urban jobs. So hey, that's those are both significant revolutions. We actually had a third one in the 1940s and 50s, right around the time of World War II and afterwards. It's called the Third Agricultural Revolution. It's nicknamed the Green Revolution. What happens here is that we take a lot of new technology that we develop. Now that's modern technology like tractors and plows. What we also did is we took large amounts of things we were using. By the way, the Second Agricultural Revolution, it wasn't just about machinery. It was also about introducing fertilizers and pesticides for the first time. A lot of farmers weren't using those or were using natural ones. Now we develop much, much stronger ones that we're able to use. And so farmers are using fertilizer, they're using pesticides, they're using things like crop rotation, which is a new method for growing crops that we understood better. They're using machinery in order to mass produce food for the first time so they can sell it commercially. Now, Third Agricultural Revolution, this one that I'm on right now, started 50 to 75 years ago. This is when we take a lot of those fertilizers, pesticides, and other new technologies, and we begin to ship them over to developing countries. We ship them over to Asia, we ship them over to Africa. Not only do we send over pesticides and fertilizers so that those countries can begin to mass produce as well to meet the needs of our growing population, but also we develop new plants that, for instance, are resistant to disease, plants that are resistant to certain weeds, plants that are resistant to certain pests. And we develop these in the laboratory. We develop seeds and other methods where we're able to produce these plants that gives them advantages and allows them to survive in locations where they would not have before. In addition to that, we also develop what are called dwarf plants. So we're able to produce plants that are smaller in size but still produce the same amount of product, which means you can plant more of them and therefore grow more plants on an acre of land than you could have previously when you were using regularly sized ones. So, first agriculture revolution, people start to farm for the first time, but they do it for subsistence reasons. Second agricultural revolution is when we start to mass produce using machinery, new methods, new technology, fertilizer, pesticides, and we begin to produce commercially for the first time where we sell them instead of just feeding ourselves. And then the third agricultural revolution, thanks to even the more modern technology, we're now sending a lot of those pesticides, fertilizers, and other innovations to developing countries to allow them to massively produce food to feed their populations. We're also developing pest and weed-resistant crops and dwarf crops in order to more effectively, also drought-resistant. We developed seeds that can grow in areas without a lot of water, where traditionally that plant would have needed more amounts. Anyways, all of this is called the Green Revolution, and it started 50 to 75 years ago. In some places, it's actually still continuing today. And what we see is massive increases in developing countries' agricultural production. So in the second agricultural revolution, you start to see massive increases in developed countries' agricultural production. In the third, you start to see more of it in the developing countries of the world. In modern times, like now, we're also developing more and more genetically engineered crops. Those are known as GE, genetically engineered crops, or GMOs, genetically modified organisms, which are products that are produced either entirely or partly in the lab or with chemicals or products that are produced in a lab. So again, second agricultural revolution, farming was revolutionized, better tools, fertilizers, better harvesting methods, better storage. We're able to better store products. We will slowly develop things like refrigeration, which is going to keep farm products fresher for longer. And better distribution. We're able to get our products to the market faster using railroad and other methods. All of these develop around the same time. All of them lead to massive improvements in production. Because productivity increased, so did our population and our health, our age. We started to age longer. We started to become more healthy because now we're eating more fruits and veggies. And of course, population increases, which of course leads to, more people and more production in other areas. Mechanization also changed the landscape. From now on, instead of, kind of like individualized agriculture, we start to try to mass produce, and vast rows of crops were known, and they were seen, because, well, hey, that was considered to be the most efficient use of your land, to plow rows of crops, to take advantage of every piece of space, to try to mass produce as much as you could. It also helped machines, obviously, to get through the crops faster if they were lined in rows like that. For the first time in the Second Agricultural Revolution, we start to see land use differences. We start to see certain areas or regions of a country or a continent become the ranch area, and other areas become the paddy area where you grew rice, and other areas which might be the dairy area. Prior to that, a lot of this production was done right next to each other, or maybe even on the same piece of land, by farmers that were doing it on a small scale. So you might have one dairy cow that you supplied, milk and butter and cheese to your family with. You might have, your own, grain, a few rows of grain or a few rows of fruit and vegetables. And so you would grow that all on the same farm. Well, when we switched to Second Agricultural Revolution, farms start to specialize, and they would produce only a certain crop or maybe just a couple of crops on all of their land. And so therefore you saw certain regions of a country or a continent kind of specialize in one thing that they do very well. The Third Agricultural Revolution, again, from the 20th century, really all the way till the present. Again, it's known as the Green Revolution. Remember when we heard about Malthus earlier in the year, that bad pessimist guy? Not a bad guy, but a pessimist, who talked about, hey, we were going to eventually run out of food, population would increase faster. Remember, he was disproved by the Second Agricultural Revolution. But remember, neo-Malthusians developed and said, hey, it is going to happen. It's going to happen in 1900s instead, because eventually our population will grow so quickly and agriculture won't keep up. Well, because of this, this is why they were wrong as well. This is why neo-Malthusians have been proven wrong in addition to their original founder. Now, this Third Agricultural Revolution is still going on. Again, you get new high-yield crops. You find new techniques like crop rotation that were never used in Asia or the developing world before. Fertilizers, pesticides, all of these are introduced for the first time. Now, how did they, what the developed countries do is they oftentimes will sell or loan these products to farmers in developing countries. If they need to, they might give some of the technology away as well, or some of these products as well, to get the farmers hooked on them, I guess you could say, and then after that, they're going to try to charge for it. You see new higher yield crops. Again, those are those dwarf crops that allow you to produce more on the same amount of land than you ever were before. Genetic engineering is going to develop. We use it to develop more resistant and modified seeds that are better able to survive in harsh environments, maybe too dry environment or a too wet environment. Now that seed allows it to survive. We also developed new irrigation methods like drip irrigation, where you have a hose with holes in it, and they drip water onto the plant constantly to supply a more constant, regular amount of water. It also saves water so it doesn't flow away and you waste it. We also developed, and the whole point here was, remember, it's a fight between food production against population. And so we needed to mass produce, not just in the developed countries like the U.S., we needed developing countries to be able to mass produce using the same methods we had developed in the developed places. Now, disadvantages of the Green Revolution. Well, economic issues. One, it tends to make developing countries way more dependent on developed ones, right? Because they need the developed countries' technology and fertilizer and pesticide and science and technology in order to continue to produce the crops that they need. It also puts a lot of developing countries' farmers into debt. They're unable to afford a lot of these products. Sometimes they're able to borrow, other times they're not, and so they have to go without. In addition to that, it makes many of these powerful agricultural transnational corporations even more powerful, because not just developed countries farmers, but now developing country farmers
depend on them for all of their products. Politically, why is the Green Revolution? What disadvantages politically does it lead to? Well, there's a couple I would mention. One, it does sometimes lead to a backlash from consumers in developed countries who are upset, for instance, with the use of laboratories to produce products. Sometimes there's worries and concerns about the health of the products, the healthiness of the products, and the impact it might have on consumers. In addition to that, again, oftentimes developing country governments are really dependent on these products from developed countries, and so it's going to make that government more dependent on transnational corporations and on banks and on developed governments like the U.S. For assistance. Environmentally, hey, we're spreading massive amounts of fertilizer, pesticides, and other chemicals throughout the developing world. These are places generally that don't have a lot of protections, don't have a lot of cleanup methods, and so you better believe that water sources around the world, land is being highly polluted through these mass production methods. Socially, gender. What we're seeing in a lot of places is that socially, again, a lot of farmers are really kind of struggling with this, or struggling to survive. We're seeing changes to family sizes in some places, which is putting more of a strain on farmers as well. Gender-wise, we're seeing women that play a huge role in agriculture in a lot of places. Oftentimes women are responsible for growing products for themselves, so that's a lesser disadvantage, but it gives women less opportunity oftentimes to pursue other methods other than agriculture. Okay, don't worry too much about that last disadvantage. All right, let's get to subsistence farming. I already mentioned what this is. This is the growing of food, of agricultural crops for consumption by that person and their family. Now, hey, you may have a little excess. If you do, you usually sell it. You sell it right away to the people that are around you, maybe your village mates, maybe your other family members, because you can't really store it or hold on to it because it usually goes bad if you don't have the technology to store it, so you try to sell it. Subsistence farmers usually do not own their own land. I should say, yeah, they don't own their own land. And they usually move around fairly often. They'll grow on land for a short amount of time, and then they will move to another one, and then so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of like what I would call semi-nomadic. They move to a new location, they'll grow crops there for a few months, maybe a half a year, and then they'll move to another place a few miles away and do the same thing. Today, subsistence farming usually only exists in developing countries around the world. There's virtually none that goes on in developed countries. I can't think of any. If you wanted to define subsistence farming and contrast it with commercial, one way to do that would be to look at it in 5 different ways. 1, how is it different than commercial farming? Well, 1, in the purpose of farms. Farms are there to produce for your own needs in subsistence farming. Extras are sold to the government or other businesses, but that's not the intent of the farmer. His goal is to just make enough to survive. In addition to that, in developing countries, because there are not a lot of tertiary or even sometimes secondary jobs, a lot of folks are still farmers. So one way to look at a country and to determine whether there's a lot of subsistence farming is, besides looking at what farms are producing and for whom, another one is to look and see at what percentage of a population are farmers. If it's 30% or 40% or 50% or higher, that's a developing country, because a huge majority of their population is still working in agriculture, which means they're still probably farming for themselves. They are. Also, another method you can analyze a country's agricultural development is with their use of machinery. If it's mostly hand tools or maybe animal power, but individual animals, then that's almost always an indicator in today's day and age of a developing country. Now, hey, some developing countries do have machinery, but the point here is, even where they'll have machinery, it'll be fewer and far between compared to a developed country, and you will still see a lot more people depending on human power or animal power to get stuff done. The size of the farms is also another measure of your agricultural development and tells you whether you are a subsistence or a commercial country. If most of your farms are small in terms of size, so we're talking about less than maybe 5 acres, then that's usually a good sign that you are a developing country. That's going to mean if you have a lot of very small farms, that you have a lot of farmers. They're only farming the land that they can in order to provide for themselves. So that's usually a sign of a subsistence farming country. And then relationship to others, the answer is virtually none. Farmers don't really have much of a relationship with each other. They don't really depend or need one another, since most of the subsistence farmers are growing all of their own food. They really only need to depend on themselves. They might only grow like 4 or 5 or 6 foods and then maybe exchange some with other nearby farmers to have a more, balanced diet. But even then, that's pretty rare, not really required. Now, commercial farming is the opposite. It's the other end of the spectrum. It's the opposite of subsistence, and you need to be able to compare and contrast these two things. Commercial farming is the growing of agricultural crops or products for sale and for trade to businesses, government, and the public. So big difference here. You're not really growing for your own needs. You're going for trade. And that means you're going to generally grow the products that you think you can get the most value for. Commercial farmers usually do own the land that they operate on. So as a result, they're staying there year-round, and they are trying to produce as much as possible on that land to use it the most efficiently. They make more efficient use of their land than subsistence farmers do. And so there are far fewer farmers in commercial agriculture than there are in subsistence. In the United States, for instance, about 2% of our workforce is farmers. In other developing countries, it's usually less than 5. I've already mentioned in developing countries, it's at least double digits and usually 20, 25, 30% or way higher than that. So commercial farming exists primarily in MDCs, and ways you can distinguish it from subsistence. 1, purpose farm is to sell farm products usually to the market. Most of the time nowadays it's to sell them to food processing companies. So most farmers have deals with transnational corporations, and most of their crops go to that company. Corn farmers will sell them to Frito-Lay, for instance, to make corn chips and other corn products. A potato farmer will sell them to In-N-Out or to a potato chip company, for instance. So you'll have deals with particular food processing companies, and all or most of your products will go there. Fruit farms will have deals with, fruit juice like Dole or other companies like that. So the purpose is to sell products from the farm, usually to food processing companies, but also to grocers as well. Percentage of workers in the industry is usually 5% or less, like I've mentioned. Use of machinery is going to be widespread. There's going to be a lot of machinery. There's going to be a lot of different types. There's going to be a large number. You're going to see tractors in order to pull plows and to do a number of other farm duties. You're going to have combine machines, which are used to usually harvest grain and other wheat and other grain products. You're going to have plows that are used to plow land, to clear it for planting and other purposes. You're going to have other farm machines like a binder or a reaper, which is used for various purposes. You're going to have, the use of railroads and trucks. Oftentimes, these railroads will maybe have track that rolls right up to these large farms that exist. Trucks are going to be loading and unloading on a regular basis all throughout the day. There will oftentimes be a warehouse or a distribution facility located on site. Transportation systems, like I said, you're going to see railroads and roads connecting directly to freeways or highways that are oftentimes directly connected to the farm itself. These commercial farms oftentimes are at the center of new scientific improvements. So you're going to see lab testing going on, products constantly being researched and designed. You're going to be seeing new methods, new techniques that are experimented with, new seeds, new crops, more resistance. any way that you can scientifically improve to make healthier, more productive plants, commercial farmers will generally do it. New technology, even electronics. A lot of electronics can be used, for instance, maybe noise machines in order to scare away birds or other pests that might otherwise damage the crops. Another major difference with commercial farming is the size of farms. Most of the farms are large, over 500 acres. So we're talking about like 5 to 10 acres in subsistence farms. Compare that to 500 plus, and those are actually small, so much larger usually. Most farms identify as family-owned, even though they might be run by a corporation or have a deal with a corporation. They still may be family-owned. The U.S. is dominated by huge farms, massive ones. We've lost a lot of farms and farmers, but we've actually gained farmland. So what that means is, even though we've lost a lot of people who used to be farmers to other jobs, to the cities, the farmers who do remain have larger farms than ever before and actually control or own more farmland than ever before. Because, we're able to bring irrigation and other things to places that used to not be able to support crops. We've added to the ecumene, which means we've added to our arable land that can grow crops on it. Anyways, the relationship to other farms in a commercial situation are very linked to one another. They work very closely with one another. They're oftentimes specializing in only producing one crop or a few crops, and so they depend on other farms to maybe produce other crops as well. There, for instance, might be growing soybeans, and then those soybeans are shipped to the animal farm to feed the animals. The animal farm then has manure that it ships back to the soybean farm to use as fertilizer or pesticides. So it's very linked not only to other farms, but absolutely linked to food processing centers and to factories, warehouses, and distribution centers. So oftentimes farms are actually just one part of the production process. Farming is almost run like a factory now, where one corporation called an agribusiness will control the farm, they'll control the warehousing, they'll control the trucking, they'll control the food processing factories, they'll control sometimes even the sellers. Now we get into types of agriculture, and I'm going to focus in this video on the ones on the left. So we've already talked about the difference between subsistence and commercial. Now we're going to go through each of the types of subsistence agriculture. There are 4 listed here, including one that has 2 types. To be honest with you, this last one isn't subsistence. It's technically commercial, but since it's done in developing countries, we put it into the subsistence side because subsistence is usually done in developing places. All right, so let's get to it. We're going to start with shifting cultivation. Now, before we do that, this is the old famous climate map that was developed by a guy named Köppen, a famous geographer, way back in the 1800s. And what he did was he said, hey, I can divide the world up into 5 major climate regions. The A, the B, the C, the D, and the E. And what he said was, there's also highlands, mountains that he separated. And what he said was, hey, based on this, I think there's humid areas. Those are the orange on this map. There are dry. Those are the gray, desert areas. There are warmer mid-latitudes and colder mid-latitude areas. And then there are the polar or the ice areas, the Arctic areas. And he speculated, hey, that certain crops would succeed or grow in certain areas. To be honest with you, when you look at that map and then you compare it to our agricultural map, what you're going to find is climate matters a lot in determining which crops grow where and why. So one of the greatest influences that explains why certain crops exist where they do is the climate and the amount of water and sunlight, I should say water, that's really available. So the heat and the water availability are the major determinants. Look at this map, for instance, focus on the A regions, the orange, and then notice those same areas in South America, in Africa, they tend to have certain crops that dominate there in those places and only in those places, right? Come over here. You look and you see some of the same light green colors there, right? So obviously there looks to be some parallels here between the climate map and the agricultural map that shows all the different types of agriculture and what dominates where. Alrighty? For instance, look at the green, the warm mid-latitudes. You see they're strong in the eastern United States and they're strong in Europe. Now, do we see, yep, look at the color, right? That's grown in almost all of those locations. It's the same colors. So it would seem those climates tend to support certain crops more than others. Let's keep that in mind. We're going to start with shifting cultivation. So let's start with this map. Let's find our shifting cultivation. It's our first type of subsistence agriculture. And look, it tells us subsistence is usually done in LDCs. Shifting cultivation is dark green. So this area, shifting cultivation. All right, this area here, all mostly shifting cultivation. And then over here, shifting cultivation as well. You'll notice shifting cultivation tends to occur along the equator, right? You notice that? And it doesn't really seem to exist the further away from the equator that you are. I wonder if that has something to do with it. Okay. So shifting cultivation is also known as slash and burn. A farmer uses axes and uses fire and he removes major vegetation. And then after that fire has been extinguished, after it's died out, you plant crops in the remaining growth and especially the ash in the charred landscape, the black ash that you've just burned, you plant crops there. All right, so you use the ash as the fertilizer to grow your crops. This is usually done in tropical environments because tropical rainforest situations don't have a lot of fertilizer. They're not really good for growing farm crops. And so therefore, by burning the land and destroying the big trees and then burning them down and then using the ash that's produced, you can actually artificially produce fertilizer in places that wouldn't have it. It's actually kind of brilliant. Again, crops are planted after you have cleared the land by chopping it down and then burning it. Depending on where you're located, it's known by different things. It was called swidden in Africa and in South Asia, but it was also known as lading or milpa in other parts of Asia. All of those meant the same thing. That was a place that had just been cleared so that crops could be grown there. Now, the farmers grow on the land for a few years, and then they leave it fallow. They leave it empty so that the land can replenish and the nutrients that have been destroyed during that process are allowed to grow back. So slash and burn or shifting cultivation is called shifting cultivation because the people who practice it shift to a new location after a few years. And what happens is villagers kind of go in like a circular pattern. So they'll start in one location for a few years, then another one, then another one, then another one, then another one, and then they're back at their original location within 5 to 20 years, and they'll do the same cycle, the same process all over again. So again, it's not that harmful to the environment because you're only engaged in this in small areas with smaller populations, and you're only doing it for a short amount of time, and you allow the land time to replenish and to rejuvenate before you come back and do it again. Where is this practiced today? Well, it's practiced in the tropical rainforest regions, some of the most isolated, some of the most separated from the rest of the world. This is a primitive way of survival, and so therefore it's generally done by folks who are living very indigenous, native lifestyles who are far removed from developed society. It's practiced in South America, especially deep in the Amazon rainforest by some of the tribes that are located there. Those folks tend to do this to grow maize, corn, and manioc, which is a root that they can both drink and eat. Southeast Asia, this is done in a few places for rice, particularly in Indonesia in Southeast Asia. Central and West Africa, it's also done in certain tropical rainforest locations. Again, millet and sorghum are the products that are used. Generally speaking, this type of agriculture is done in high-temperature places that have a lot of rainfall, so tropical rainforest locations. Again, they have a lot of water, so you would normally think, hey, you should be able to grow crops here. But because the temperatures are so hot and because there's so much rainfall, there's actually a lot of acidity in the soil, And so there's not a lot of nutrients there, and it's difficult to grow crops using methods other than this without destroying the land. Generally, what you'll see here is, Guinness, be quiet, you'll eat in a moment. Generally, what you'll see here is small villages that surround the land. And then as a group of people moves to a new area, they'll just relocate their village. So this is a very migratory lifestyle where people are moving from village to village every couple of years. So here's what's really interesting about shifting cultivation. When agriculture was originally developed, the first agricultural revolution, everybody used this method. This was the only method that developed originally. Today, only 5% of our entire world population engages in it. Now, here's what's interesting. Even though only 5% of the population uses it, it takes up about 25% of the land on Earth's surface. So it's considered very extensive, which means it requires a lot of land to produce its product, and it produces a very small amount. So when you produce a very little but you require a lot of land, you are a very extensive type of agriculture. When you produce a lot on a very small amount of land, you are very intensive. Anyways, shifting cultivation is extensive because a lot of land is being used to feed a very small overall percentage of our population. Now, hey, counter argument. This is land, a lot of times, that would not otherwise be used for agriculture if it wasn't being used for shifting cultivation. So even though it occupies a lot of land, it's land that otherwise probably wouldn't be have anything growing on it otherwise. Anyways, biggest threat to shifting cultivation is a lot of the lands that these folks need to use in order to migrate from place to place is increasingly becoming more individually owned. And so that can sometimes affect or influence shifting cultivation. Sometimes some of these folks are actually buying their own land that they've lived on previously, that they've used previously, in order to preserve this custom. Threats. The biggest threat is commercial farming. Look, ranching and logging and cash crop agriculture, which we're going to get into, are much more profitable. And so governments and corporations are actively trying to, one, get these farmers to move or leave, so it opens up these areas to different types of agriculture that can make more profit. Or two, they're trying to convince these folks to become their own employees and to do farm work for the company instead of growing crops to exist and survive on in this method. Think about development and think about which a country would prefer their workers to do, right? Which is going to attract outside investment, which is going to attract mass production, and which of these would be considered less efficient. And so therefore, shifting cultivation is absolutely threatened by commercial farming and by governments who want to see, and corporations and banks, again, who want to see people shift to commercial agriculture because you're able to produce way more efficiently with each person who is working. Remember, shifting cultivation is seen as a really slow way to improve development, and it's a really bad use of land. And so a lot of folks believe there are better alternatives that we could use instead. Now, supporters like to point out, hey, it's actually the least harmful method to grow crops on, because even though it takes up a lot of land, so few people are doing it that it's actually having the least harmful influence. And a lot of supporters of shifting cultivation point out, hey, these people who are doing it are preserving their traditional cultures. They're preserving their societies. They're our last connection to a lot of these cultures. And so when you switch that, when you force them over to commercial agriculture, or when you chop down the rainforest, what you're doing is essentially destroying these people's cultures and ways of life. Hey, I'm not going to play the video because I'm going to play that when we come back on Monday. But I'm going to play it as part of a quiz. So to be quite honest with you, if you're smart, you'll watch the video of Slash and Burn Agriculture so that when we do watch it on Monday, you're able to recognize what it is showing you. Next up here, we're going to move over to pastoral nomadism. All right, I'm going to go to the big screen here. There we go. Pastoral nomadism, what is it? It's when you are a nomad, which means you move from place to place, so you migrate. and you migrate from pasture land to pasture land. Now, why would you do that? That means you have herds, and you need those herds to graze on pasture land. And so you move around as a nomad from place to place to place in order to help your herd survive. So these are going to be herders. These are going to be folks who do not have crops per se. They have animal herds, and they are going to be moving around to support them. All right. Now, first off, let's find pastoral nomadism. First off, let's go to our climate map that we were looking at earlier. There we go. Climate map, right? I want you to focus on the gray, the dry areas, North Africa, the Middle East, right? Even the Western United States, most of Australia, much of Central Asia. Now take a look at this agricultural map. We're looking for kind of this blue color here. You see all the blue right there? Pastoral nomadism. Remember, we just looked at North Africa. Look at the Middle East. Look at Central Asia. Even the United States and Australia, you see how they have yellow. They're not engaged in pastoral nomadism, but they're still engaged in livestock raising in those places. So, drier places, generally going to have more animal raising. All right, so pastoral nomadism is based on nomadic herding of domesticated animals. Again, it's usually done in dry or arid climates, most popularly in Southwest Asia, North Africa, and Central Asia. About 15% of the world's population does it. And again, it's done on about 20% of our world's land. So again, it takes up a lot of land, so it's pretty extensive. But it is land that would otherwise probably not be used very much for agriculture. With groups who live and engage in pastoral nomadism, the size of your herd is a measure of the relative power and wealth that you have. Now, interestingly enough, these nomads, these herders, they don't usually eat their animals. They usually eat grain. And so the animal is actually kept around primarily for milk, and that milk is then turned into butter or cheese. It can also, be traded for grain with grain farmers. So you don't want to kill off your food supply. You don't want to kill off your milk supply. If the size of your herd is a measure of your strength, then killing your herd to eat the meat is really inefficient and is a real waste in many of these societies. You actually want to care for them as much as possible. You want to really treat them as well as possible because these herds are your livelihood. Many of these pastoral nomads, as they're called, have modified lifestyles. They may actually practice grain agriculture. They may grow wheat for part of the year, and then at other parts of the year, they're going to travel around with their herds, and they're going to trade that milk for grain in other places. Now, depending on where you live, it's going to influence what your herd is made up of. In Southwest Asia, in North Africa, the most common is the camel. You'll also see some sheep and goat herds, but camel is most common. That makes sense. Camel can survive in really harsh, dry environments. So again, camel is the prized animal, right? It's the largest. It's considered the most profitable. And so camels are especially prized throughout the drier areas. Sheep and goats in areas that usually can have a little bit more water. And in Central Asia, like I mentioned, not a surprise because remember, it originated there. It's the hearth area. Central Asia as well. Generally, horse is the primary pastoral nomad animal. But hey, in Arctic conditions, there's a video on reindeer. So, I mean, it really is dependent on your climate and your circumstances and what works best. Anyways, lands are usually clearly known. And so what pastoral nomads usually have is they kind of almost have turf or land that they use to feed their herds. And it's kind of controlled by groups of nomads, and they oftentimes alter their routes based on the wet and dry seasons, so they don't, have conflict or competition with one another. But a lot of times what pastoral nomads engage in is something called transhumance. It's the seasonal movement of livestock between the mountain and pasture lands. So during the warm, spring and summer months, they'll move them up into the highlands, into like the hilly and mountainous areas, in order to graze on the fresh grassland that's available once the snows melt. And then during the winter months, and fall months, they'll move them down into lower areas, flatter pasture lands, looking more for available grassland during those more barren months. So again, really seasonally dependent on what movement there is. It's seriously declining around the world, just like shifting cultivation, because again, as all subsistence agriculture, there's a lot of pressure to switch over to commercial instead. Modern governments are really better able to control regions and their nomadic populations better than ever before. So China, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, all of these countries no longer have frontiers. They have more patrolled borders now. They have transportation and communication systems. And so they don't really want pastoral nomads who oftentimes are moving across country lines in order to get to these pasture lands. There's a little bit of a security threat there. It's just viewed as something that is not really desirable in regards to production as well. Again, governments are continuing to take and convert land with irrigation for other types, for intensive or commercial agriculture. And so a lot of the best land for pasture land is being taken and used for other purposes. Also, hey, there's mining, there's oil, there's natural gas in a lot of these arid environments. And so those industries will take land and use it for those purposes. So pastoral nomads are seeing a lot of their land taken from them by other competitors. Also, just like shifting cultivation, just like slash and burn, nomads are pressured to switch to sedentary agriculture. They're pressured to maybe work for corporations. Or, in some instances, this is interesting, governments have bought pastoral nomad land and then they fenced it off. And they've only allowed pastoral nomads on it, but they have to stay within the fenced areas. Anyways, kind of a funny, unique way of trying to solve the problem. Hey, 250 million people are participating in this today, so it is going to be around for a long time. It's much larger, for instance, than shifting cultivation. All right, in a couple of videos you need to watch if you want to really know your stuff, but I'm not going to show them as part of this video because there's a weird reverb when I try to play the video through my video. Two other types of subsistence agriculture you need to know. They're very similar to one another. They're called intensive subsistence agriculture, both of them. The real difference is whether rice is grown or not. In very high population density LDCs, other methods of subsistence agriculture, like shifting cultivation or like pastoral nomadism, they just aren't productive enough. The populations are too high. And so therefore, those methods won't work. They won't feed enough people. So the farmers in these areas have developed what are called intensive subsistence agriculture. It dominates in the high populations, especially East Asia and South Asia. Small farms here, small farm size areas. And so you have small subsistence family farms where people are trying to maximize and produce as much as they can on every little bit of land they possibly have. Families use carefully developed practices to maximize the land for agriculture. They reduce animal and human usage of the land. Humans don't walk on any of it, for instance. Animals don't walk on it. You don't want trails or anything because that's taking land where crops could be grown and wasting it just to move along. Most work is done by hand or animal power here. Again, you can't have big machines. You can't have big animals in there because if you do, they're going to trample your crops. They're going to destroy some of the land that would be needed, and you're trying to maximize production and efficiency on every square inch you possibly can. These groups will flatten land. They will take hills or mountainsides and they will flatten them. That's called terracing. To create more flat land in order to grow rice and other products on it. They will develop really elaborate ditches and creeks and streams that they dig and produce in order to bring water long distances in order to produce rice. Or sometimes they will develop systems to get rid of water if there's too much of it in an area in order to drain it to allow for rice to be cultivated. All of this done by hand, oftentimes with primitive stone tools. Asia is divided into areas where rice practices dominate and where they do not. Those that do engage in what's called wet rice dominant intensive subsistence agriculture. They plant rice seedlings on dry land, and then they flood other areas with water, and then at one point they take the seedlings of the rice and they plant them into the flooded water. So actually rice at one point is grown completely underwater. The actual flooded area is known as a paddy. That's why we call it a rice paddy or a sawa. Depending on where you are in Africa, it's called a sawa, and Asia and India. Wet rice dominates in Southeast China. It dominates in East India and most of Southeast Asia. That's why rice is such a staple in those areas. Where there is enough water, rice is grown. All right? It's very labor intensive. Almost everything is done by hand. Everything is done by human power with maybe a little bit of animal assistance. Usually it required large families to grow and to work all of that land. And so therefore, Asian families had massive numbers of children to support them. Now, in wet rice dominant areas, you might use animals to clear the land, which means to graze it. All right. And that might be the only time you do, because otherwise they're going to be trampling your crops, which you can't afford on such small farms. Rice requires really particular amounts of water to grow. At different times during the growing season, you need none, some, or a bunch of water. And so it's usually grown in areas that are river valleys, that are border rivers, that have a lot of water availability throughout the year. In addition to that, they often form in areas where locals will build ditches, they'll build walls in order to try to prevent flooding or to allow for irrigation at different times if they need it. Rice grows best on flat land, so incredible efforts are made by these folks to flatten all of their existing land. Terracing hilly land to make food available is a common example of how people modify their environment and create a cultural landscape in order to create more flattened land to grow even more rice on. In some warmer climates in Asia, double cropping occurs, where you grow rice in the wet season, and then during the dry season, you grow grain or things that do not require as much water to use. That's a method they could use to make it even more intensive and to grow crops year-round, where that practice is supported. Again, intensive subsistence wet rice is this light purple color, and as you can see, it's generally done in coastal or river areas throughout Asia's massive population centers. All right. Notice the dark purple here. That's also done in the same areas of East and South Asia. It's also spread more throughout the rest of the world as well. These are intensive methods, but there's not enough water to support rice, so they use the same methods, but they grow other crops instead. Again, climate's too dry, winters are too cool, and so rice won't work. Instead, they grow grains or oats or corn or maybe even a cash crop. They use crop rotation throughout the years to grow different crops at different times. And very efficient use of limited land. So same idea, they're going to use every square inch of their land to try to maximize efficiency and maximize production to keep up with the huge populations. Problems. Again, governments tend to not support this method because it's viewed as less productive than the mass-produced commercial agriculture. In addition to that, intensive subsistence farmers have a lot of pressure from corporations and industrial companies like mining operations to maybe try to switch over and work for them. There's also major environmental and ecological dangers. These folks are using fertilizer and pesticides in large numbers, and when you're using that with flowing water, like with rice, that has a tendency to cause a lot of water and soil pollution. And then finally, the government of China actually worked to get people to not do this for a period of time. They actually tried to eliminate individual farms and create these huge mass community farms called communes. It wasn't very successful, but it's an example of how the government may actively work against this type of agriculture in some places. Finally, plantation agriculture. Now, again, this is technically commercial, But since it is done in, for the most part, LDCs in developing countries, then we technically put it in with that group. All right, so plantation agriculture is blue. As you can see, it's usually done in coastal areas of developing countries, along the coastline, easier access to trade, to get the products that are made up to the developed world. All right, so the big difference is what you're going to see here with plantation ag is that the products, even though they're grown in developing countries, they're usually consumed in developed ones. All right, so it's a type of commercial agriculture, and it's found in LDCs. It's the only type of commercial ag that dominates in LDCs. Again, it's usually tropical or coastal places. It's large farms that are called plantations. They're usually owned by a corporation or an agribusiness company. And all they do is specialize in producing the one product that the agribusiness needs in order to produce its goods. They usually specialize in one or two crops, often cash crops, again, crops that are designed to make the most possible sale possible. They're not designed to feed anybody. They're designed to make the most amount of money. So if the people want blueberries, for instance, we're going to grow blueberries because that's what we can make the most money for. They usually specialize in producing crops. These are usually tropical crops, all right? So I want like pineapple, other fruits for fruit juices, banana, guava, kiwi, coconuts. Crops are processed into food products, and it's usually done directly at the facility. This is in order because these products generally are bulk reducing food products over time. It makes sense to actually turn the fruit into a fruit juice there on site and then to just transport it directly to the market in the developed country. We're using primarily local workers in plantation agriculture. That's why they're located there, because you can use local workers at reduced wages. Now, the manager, the person that runs the farm, is usually from an MDC, but the workers are usually locally developing country workers. They're usually in remote areas. Work can be sporadic. It can be seasonal because these plantations may not run year-round. And again, they are specialty products, cash crop and other specialty products that are in high demand in MDCs. And so corporations build these massive plantations to specialize in producing one or a few products that are then entirely shipped over to be sold in MDC stores. Palm oil is real popular right now. It's in a lot of different products, skincare and other things. So like palm is another thing that is being grown on these plantations as well. All right, folks, I'm going to stop it there because I think that's where our slides end. Mr. M, watch this video. Got a big quiz on it when we come back.